Many have said that The Last of Us Part 2 is a sequel about hate. That's what people have stated is the theme of the game, it's what most people who've played the game are talking about. And yeah, sure, the game's narrative centers around characters that experience and act on that emotion, but there's more to The Last of Us Part 2 than just hate, even if the Metacritic score says otherwise. And yes, I do have some problems with the game, namely pacing, but instead of doing a review that talks generally, I wanted to talk more specifically about something that I found most interesting in my experience playing the game. And that is that, despite what you've heard, the real theme of The Last of Us Part 2 is empathy. But first, let's rewind a bit. In the finale of The Last of Us Part 1, Joel kills this surgeon. After traveling for a year with a 14-year-old girl named Ellie, who is immune to the fungal virus that has swept the country, Joel finally fulfills his mission to deliver her to a group known as the Fireflies, who are looking to use her immunity in order to develop a vaccine. After being told that the procedure of developing a vaccine would mean Ellie's death, the same girl who Joel, despite how hard he resisted, eventually embraced as a surrogate daughter, and the same girl that allowed him to recover from the effects of his own daughter's death at the start of the game, Joel makes the selfish decision to doom humanity's chance at a cure and kill all the Fireflies who stand in his way so he can escape with her. All so that he doesn't lose another daughter. In his bloody rampage, the game forces you to kill this surgeon. It is optional to kill the remaining 2 in the room, but this one, the game does not give you any choice. You have to kill him to finish the game. So, I did. Fast forward to The Last of Us Part 2, which shows that Joel's slaughter of the Fireflies and the decision to doom the world inevitably caught up with him, with a band of ex-Fireflies tracking Joel to Jackson and new character Abby mercilessly torturing and beating him to death with a golf club, while Ellie can do nothing but watch. It's a brutal scene, and a narrative decision that seems to have been controversial with members of the fanbase. But having played as Joel and becoming as attached to him as I was through the first game, even though I didn't agree with his final decision, it effectively did what it set out to do. It made me really fucking hate Abby. And so we set off to Seattle in the sequel as Ellie, on what seems like another simple revenge narrative. Across 3 days, Ellie hunts the people connected to Abby one by one in order to get closer to her. But although there are peaceful moments in her interactions with her girlfriend Dina, where the old Ellie slips out, we also see a darker side to her, one that is entirely fixated on revenge at the expense of others, and one that has seemingly taken on a lot of Joel's traits, namely his effectiveness at killing people. Where in the first game, Ellie was saying stuff like, "Oh my god," in reaction to Joel brutally killing enemies, now other characters are saying the exact same thing to her. Jesus, Ellie. But it doesn't matter to Ellie, because all that matters is getting justice, and the game's story relies on your attachment from playing as Joel in the first game and your understanding of Ellie's relationship with him that, while complicated, has an underlying love to it, so you were on board for making this bitch pay. And just when Ellie and Abby come face to face once again, effectively at the midpoint of the story, the screen cuts to black, and you're forced to play the last 3 days and a series of flashbacks from Abby's perspective. It was at this point in the game that I knew exactly what Naughty Dog was trying to do. They wanted me to empathize with the villain of this story, and I felt sorry for them, because I thought there was no way in hell that I was going to change my mind about this character. But eventually, I did. At first, I hated playing as Abby, and I think it goes to show in how many times she accidentally fell to her death. I kept having this weird thought in the back of my mind that the game was somehow broken and that there must have been something wrong with my copy. This is the person we've spent the whole game up until this point hating, just like Ellie. So she is the last person you want to play as. This change in perspective does also mean that the narrative momentum carried by the previous section where you played as Ellie screeches to a halt, as you effectively begin the game again with new weapons, crafting items, and upgrade slots for Abby to fill. But looking back on my time with the game, I think this jarring shift in rewinding the clock halfway through the narrative was kinda done on purpose. It's meant to provoke a response of frustration or confusion in the player when you start playing as her. That's the whole point. You're not supposed to just immediately like and care about Abby from the second you start playing as her. But as we play through Abby's storyline, and she finds herself caring for two members of an enemy cult faction known as the Seraphites, The Last of Us Part 2 uses its interactive medium as a video game to create empathy, literally making you walk in Abby's shoes until you feel as attached to her as you would to Joel or Ellie, as we experience the world through her eyes. It was a pretty ballsy decision by Naughty Dog in forcing the player to play half the game as someone they spent the other half hating. And even if you still hate her by this point, the game challenges her introduction as a villain as you continue playing by trying to make you consider that the person we want to die so badly is someone more than what we initially thought. As these new Seraphite characters start to humanize her, we see Abby in a different light. We see her as someone who is still flawed, as other characters point out in the game, but someone who does care about other people. Someone who has their own fears. Someone who jokes and can hold their own banter. Someone who can learn compassion for an enemy and eventually learn to let go of the same urge for vengeance that now drives Ellie. Her character arc leads to this moment in her final confrontation with Ellie, where after everything that's happened to her, after everyone she's lost because of Ellie and her friends, she still says,
"I'm not gonna fight you."
Oh, and before I forget, remember that surgeon that Joel killed back in part 1? Well, we're shown in a flashback that, surprise, turns out he was Abby's dad, revealing more personal motivations for killing Joel in the first place. I don't think Naughty Dog really expects all players to come around and completely like Abby, but she is still someone who, even if you don't end up coming around to even just a little bit, you still understand her. It's the same way where I don't agree with Joel's selfish decision to sacrifice humanity, but I understand why he does it, because I understand him. This whole Abby section of the game makes the boss fights between Abby versus Ellie or Ellie versus Abby so excruciating to play, knowing the complicated backstories of these characters and their relationships with others. It's interesting because in most games they're trying to get the player and the character to merge emotionally on some level, but in these boss fights there's a disassociation between what I want and what, for example, Ellie wants in her endgame fight with Abby. And that's funny because I did feel like Ellie at the start of the game, hating this new group of survivors and swearing revenge. But due to the hours I spent as Abby, by the end of the game, that's no longer the case. That's the player journey that I think Naughty Dog is taking you on here. Part 2 is not just a simple follow-up, it's less interested in building character relationships than the first game, and more focused on its themes and wanting to use its interactive medium in order to challenge you. Even from the way that enemies call out the names of those you kill, I found it so hard not to feel uncomfortable about my violent actions, and genuinely feel for the large waves of human enemies that you clear out. This game series' main characters aren't heroic. This isn't a series where the morality is clear-cut into good guys and bad guys. In fact, Joel, Abby, and now Ellie have all done things that could classify them as villains. It's just a matter of whose perspective we're looking through. It's a series that challenges your ability to empathize with its characters, even the ones you initially hate. Not to necessarily like these people and condone the actions they take, but to at least understand them.